Yeah, we will be recording this for later viewing on YouTube. So,
Beautiful.
all right, well, let's get started. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the latest lecture presented by the Albert Kahn Legacy Foundation, a nonprofit 501c3 foundation dedicated to honoring the life, innovations, and global influence of Detroit's great architect, Albert Kahn. If you would like to know more about us, see about becoming a member or become a sponsor of some of our events, please visit the website, albertkahnlegacy.org. It's albertkahnlegacy.org. Tonight's lecture, the latest in our series, is by Dale Carlson, Albert Kahn, Unintended Consequences. But before we get to Dale, let me just give you the word on a couple of upcoming events. A month from now, February 23rd at 7 p.m., Karen Kincaid Brady will be lecturing on some of Albert Kahn's aviation-related projects. And late April through May and June, the foundation is mounting with the partnership of the Detroit Historical Museum, a major exhibit at the Historical Museum on the life and work and global reach of Albert Kahn. If you'd like to learn more about any of these events that we have upcoming and how to become a member and a sponsor, again, please visit that website, albertkahnlegacy.org. Let's see. One housekeeping thing, you'll notice at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. Please use that for your questions. I'll be fielding questions after Dale finishes his presentation. We'll get into as many questions as we can. So please do not hit the raise hand. Please hit the Q&A button and put your questions in there. Now let me introduce Dale Carlson, a longtime researcher and author on architectural matters in Detroit. Among much else, he is the author of Corrado Parducci, a field guide to Detroit's architectural sculptor. And tonight he's speaking on Albert Kahn, Unintended Consequences. And Dale, I'll let you explain what that's all about. So over to you, please.
Great. Thank you so much for the, oh, I'm sorry, John, the host has disabled participant screen sharing. So we'll need to, shouldn't take but a second.
Sorry, I thought we had taken care of that. Let's see. Oh, let me make you a co-host. And that's
Boom.
Okay.
And now may I share screen?
Yes. Go ahead.
It looks like I can. And let me just get my bearings here real quick, folks. Hit the play button. And it looks like we're in business. Thank you very much for the introduction, John. And thank you all for attending tonight. My name is Dale A. Carlson, and I am the author of Kahn's Detroit, a field guide to Albert Kahn designs of the metro area, which I just published in the last few weeks. I've been invited tonight to lecture to you all for about 45 to 50 minutes about unique and unexpected adaptive renovations, reuses, and remodelings of Albert Kahn designs in the city of Detroit. Before I go any further, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Albert Kahn Legacy Foundation for inviting me to lecture, to Albert Kahn Associates Incorporated, Barbara Maggie Cohn, Heidi Fannis, Caitlin Wunderlich, John Cole, John Gallagher, Michael G. Smith, and Michael H. Hodges, all of whom were very helpful in the development of either my book or my lecture. Thank you all. I will break down tonight's lecture into 5 segments. Because so many of my lecture hosts in the past have asked me to add biographical material about how I came to get into writing books about architectural history. I'll start with that. We'll do a very short Albert Kahn bio for those in the audience who are not super familiar with his early life and how he came to prominence as an architect. We will discuss very quickly 2 primary types of influence an architect can exert with their work. And then we'll get to the countdown of 25 adaptive renovations, reuses, or remodels of Albert Kahn structures. And we'll finish off tonight with a Q&A. I'll try not to step out of my areas of expertise during that time. So let's start off with my bio. And my interest in architectural history begins in the early 1990s when I leave my home in Traverse City, Michigan to attend college at Michigan State University in East Lansing. And back then I had a lot more hair. And I loved going to Detroit just about every weekend for years on end to take in their exploding Detroit techno and house music scene at that time. And as a wild-eyed youngster, seeing huge skyscrapers for the first time in my life regularly, I definitely took notice of the difference in the epic size and proportion of constructions down here as compared to my hometown. And that was probably the genesis of my interest in Detroit architectural history. On one of my weekend forays into Detroit in about 1993, I ran into a friend of mine who I grew up with in Traverse City, and he recommended I visit the Guardian building, a building that I had never heard of until that point. I took him up on his suggestion, and my first visit to the Guardian was a watershed moment that greatly deepened my interest in the state's architectural history. Just a few months later down the road, I purchased for my mom on her birthday in 1994 a copy of a book entitled Buildings of Michigan by a former state historic preservation officer by the name of Catherine Bishop Eckert. And I immediately borrowed the book from my mother and have yet to return it. So happy birthday, Mom. In the 1990s and the 2000s, I would take this book with me pretty much anytime I traveled the state, which was very frequently. And it was also the first place I was introduced to the name of Corrado Parducci, who becomes an important part of my story down the road. We'll fast forward to 2008 now. And by this point, I'm living in Hamtramck. And I get my first digital camera. And the very first thing I start doing is driving around Detroit and taking pictures of all of my favorite buildings and then posting them on Facebook with, histories that I would dig up online. And it wasn't long before a few friends suggested, hey, Dale, these are pretty cool. Maybe you should find a better venue for, posting your architectural history studies. So with the help of some friends in 2011, I launched a website entitled ilovedetroitmichigan.com that is still up to this day, but it's probably going to come down pretty soon. I started writing about architectural history there, and it only took a few months of doing so for strangers to begin contacting me with inquiries or corrections or, just wanting to further discuss the matter that I'm presenting on my website. And one of the people I met through those correspondences was an eccentric architectural historian who lives in Arizona, but resided in Southeast Michigan through most of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Einar is Icelandic in descent, and that accounts for a somewhat uncommon first name. And after a few months of corresponding, Einar revealed to me that in the 1990s, he had hunted down a son of Corrado Parducci. And this son allowed him to photocopy Corrado Parducci's original ledgers from his studios in Detroit, as well as 700 scrapbook images showing Parducci works that he created here in Detroit over the years. Well, once I heard about the ledgers, the gears in my head, they started clicking immediately, and I decided I wanted to write a book about this subject. I had read in many places about how prolific Parducci was, but had never come across, across the evidence, that proved that statement accurate. Usually you'd find lists of 50 to 100 of his commissions. Well, here's 600 listed. And this evidence just fell in my lap, and I felt that I had to do something with it. And it took me about 7 years. But in January of 2020, I published Corrado Parducci, a field guide to Detroit's architectural sculptor. I ran into quite a few roadblocks along the way, learning to write my first book being the biggest. And the experience of writing the book was so fulfilling that the website kind of fell by the wayside. And that's why you'll probably see it come down soon, because I'm pretty much completely devoted to writing books now. And Albert Kahn was a natural second choice for me for my second book, because I had already written, with the help of Michael G. Smith, a rather large post on my webpage, my website called Albert Kahn, 400 Buildings in Southeast Michigan. So I'd already busted out a lot of the basic research for this book. So that is enough about me. You now understand how I got to the position to be writing a book about Albert Kahn. Let's talk about the subject of our discussion tonight. Albert Kahn was born in Raunen, Germany in 1869. And he lived there with his family until they relocated to Echternach in the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg in 1875. And in 1881, the family immigrates to the United States. In 1884, Kahn takes a job in the offices of Mason and Rice, and one of the firm partners, George D. Mason, who is also a very important figure in Detroit architectural history, he becomes a lifelong mentor to Kahn. And Kahn rises up to the ranks at this office and is promoted to chief designer in 1891. He spends a decade in this position before setting out on his first corporate partnership, Nettleton, Kahn, and Trowbridge. And Trowbridge leaves in 1897 to head the architectural school at Cornell University. And Nettleton dies very young at 38 in the year 1900. Kahn then reunites with Mason for 1 year to form the partnership of Mason and Kahn. And then by 1902, he sets out on his own again, this time with Ernest Wilby as his top associate. In the first year of that company's existence, his earliest reinforced concrete designs are constructed. The J.B. Book Palms apartment building on East Jefferson in Detroit, just east of downtown, and West Hall, also known as the West Engineering Building at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Just a few years down the road, he refines a lot of these reinforced concrete design techniques, and he executes some of the earliest extant auto manufacturing plant designs that are out there for the Packard Motor Car Company. This is around 1905. And the use of space and the use of reinforced concrete is so revolutionary that Kahn basically establishes his company as the preeminent designers of auto manufacturing facilities in Southeast Michigan, which is, an industry that's exploding at this time. And over the next 3 decades, Kahn goes on to design 3 plants that are highly regarded within architectural design history, probably the most important of which is the Highland Park plant. But there's also the Rouge plant and the Chrysler half-ton truck plant that are built out of practicality, and they make little attempt to hide the materials used in their construction. They're very streamlined, they're very simple, and the look of these buildings, it highly influences a group of young architects in Europe that are known as the modernists. And the most important in this group is a man by the name of Walter Gropius. And you can see from his Fageswerk shoe factory design here in Elfeld, Germany, that he is indeed being influenced to some extent by the look of Albert Kahn's early factories. And there's a few others in this group. And as their ideas coalesce and we move into later parts of the 19th century, their ideas kind of gel into a style of large building design and construction known as the international style. And it rubs off on quite a few architects who are working in North America. And we see a few examples here at the top. I've also got a couple definitions that I borrowed from different places online that I think are pretty accurate towards the bottom. This Philip Johnson example I've included is a little bit more historicist than international, but I include Johnson because he's one of the people that coins the term international style in the 1930s. The Ford World headquarters in Dearborn, we're very fortunate to have a quintessential example of the international style right here in town. And also Eero Saarinen, a practitioner of this style, he's got offices in the suburban area and works out of the Detroit area for a large part of his career. But I am not fully qualified to draw an exact straight line from Albert Kahn through the modernist to the international style. There are other people that have done that in a fashion much more eloquent than I can do. And I'd like to recommend those books tonight so that people can really understand Albert Kahn's influence on the evolution of architectural design. My first recommendation is Albert Kahn, Architect of Ford by Federico Bucci, first published in Italian in 1991 and translated to English in 1993. And also in 2001, the University of Michigan Museum of Art sponsors an exhibit curated by Brian Carter. This exhibit is called Albert Kahn Inspiration for the Modern, and there's a publication that accompanies it that features essays by Grant Hildebrand, Carter, the curator, Terry Smith, and Ann Sinfeld. And these people produce just the most eloquent, well-reasoned, well-researched explorations of Kahn's influence on later generations of building designers. But it's not only the influence on the evolution of architectural design that is important to Kahn's career. He also bears a great influence on world history based on some of the things that happened in the buildings he designed. Most importantly, the Ford Willow Run bomber plant in Ypsilanti Township that is mostly demolished, but a few buildings remained. And also the Chrysler tank arsenal in Warren, which still stands, and this is its appearance today. These factories are built early in the 40s, for the most part, in anticipation of America's increased involvement in World War II. When you hear Detroit referred to as the arsenal of democracies, what people are referring to most specifically are these two factories. The Willow Run factory produces the B-24 Liberator aircraft, and the Chrysler tank arsenal obviously produces tanks, and they produce a lot. And if we look at this quote from Motor Trend magazine from their Memorial Day issue in 2018, we'll see that Detroit, with only 2% of the nation's population, produced 10% of the nation's tools for war during the World War II era. And so we know how World War II ended up. So we see that with Kahn's designs, there is an influence on world history. And this gives us a chance to talk about the two kinds of influence an architect can exert that we'll discuss tonight. The first is obviously the evolution of architectural design, which has more to do with how the building looks and functions. But there's also the effect that what happens in, on, around, or near the building can, how it can affect culture and history. And for the purposes of tonight's lecture, we're going to be a little bit more concerned with the effect upon culture and history than we are with the evolution of architectural design. And when we ask ourselves which buildings exhibit the greatest degree of unintended consequences, we'll ask ourselves two questions. How unpredictable or unique may Albert Kahn have considered the adaptive reuse or renovation, or how likely might he have been to anticipate it? But more importantly, does the adaptive reuse or renovation intersect with an influential cultural, political, or art movement that developed after Kahn died? And this, in my personal opinions, what is going to show the highest degree of unintended consequences. I'll rate my opinions on where I think they rate on a scale of 1 to 10, but it's strictly for fun. It's not scientific. And if anybody takes issue with my rating, I would love to talk about it in our post-discussion Q&A. So now let's move on with the countdown. And we will open with our first entry, which will be the only entry that is not in the city of Detroit. And these are the Kahn Company's Soviet projects of 1929 to 1932. In those years, the Kahn Company sends 25 employees to the Soviet Union, where they reside for the length of the contracts. And these employees assist the Soviet government in the design and construction of over 500 plants. And they also assist in the education of numerous engineers in their country. And here's an example of some of the buildings that are created through this project. I don't like to try to pronounce the one on the upper left there, but we have Chelyabinsk and Stalingrad, and the original intention is to build tractors. And I think we get an idea from these drawings how epic these plants are. And when we stop to consider that there's 500, there's a lot of manufacturing happening in them. And it's really not that much of a surprise to anyone involved when it turns out in the mid-30s, as the storm clouds of war are building in Europe, that the Russians convert many of these plants to wartime production. And for those of you who are not aware, when it comes to the investment in human life and the sacrifices made in World War II, the Soviets' sacrifices dwarf pretty much any other nations. They lose over 10 million to military conflict. Combined with civilian casualties, it tops 20 million. And the Soviets give up approximately 15% of their country's entire population in World War II. It's just staggering. And it really points out how important the Eastern Front was. As Americans, we obviously hear a lot more about what happened on the Western Front, but the sacrifice the Soviets make cannot be denied. And it is actually quite frequently acknowledged in the headlines we see in American papers in the weeks following up to VE Day. And for these reasons, it is my opinion that the Soviets, They likely would not have topped the Nazi regime without the help of the munitions they built in the adaptively renovated Kahn factories. So for that reason, I consider it the most important adaptive renovations to have ever been applied to any Kahn buildings. But it's not that surprising because Kahn lived through it. And frankly, I don't think it was that a big surprise to either the Kahn Corporation or the US government when a lot of these factories were transformed in the mid to late 30s. Let's move on to our second example now. This is the old Temple Beth El at 3424 Woodward Ave in Detroit, built in 1903. This is originally a Jewish synagogue that houses a congregation that Kahn himself is a member of. And in the mid-20s, they decided to build a new temple a little bit further up Woodward. And at that time, C. Howard Crane, a prominent theater architect, is hired to fashion remodelings to be applied to the building to make it into a public theater. And Crane, he's a very prominent architect in Detroit at this time and is one of the top theater designers in the United States. He's already designed Orchestra Hall at this point, and he goes on to design the Fox Theater in the state, as well as numerous other Fox theaters and United Artists theaters in other cities. And here's an image I borrowed from Dan Austin's Historic Detroit website that shows the appearance of the building shortly after Crane's redesigns are implemented, but it's only about another decade down the road before Woodward is widened and they are forced to remove a lot of those new decorations, and they remodel again, this time covering up a lot of the classical decoration that used to be at the entrance, and we're left with our current appearance. This is a photo from my book. Kahn lived through all these renovations. I don't think he'd be the least bit surprised by any of them. And for that reason, we rated it, a 1 on the 10 scale. But there's more to this story. And that is a recently announced redevelopment plan announced by the Roxbury Group Detroit, who have managed a few other historic renovations over the last couple decades. And their goal is to return the Bonsdale Theater to its original appearance. And this plan, should it come to fruition, I think Albert Kahn would be quite surprised to find out that one of his buildings is planned to return to its original appearance in the 21st century. I'm going to rate that a 4 on the 10 scale. We're going to move on now to 9 corner banks in Detroit. We actually covered 10 in the lecture. We're just going to cover 9 right now. And corner banks are among the most common Albert Kahn design structures to be adaptively renovated for second, third, or fourth uses. And for that reason, we consider them pretty common and not that surprising. Here we have 3 that have new life as churches. 3 of them appear to be active based on my last drive-bys. The one on the lower left, I haven't seen active for a few years, but let's hope it gets an inhabitant at some point. Turning to the next page, we'll find Motor City check cashing, and that's a former bank, so it's pretty much fulfilling its original use. Also, we have JD's Mart, which is at one time a convenience store. I'm not sure what it's being used for now. Discount Beauty Supply moved out of the Gratiot Avenue branch of the Central Savings Bank there, but that's just simple retail. So we rate these first 7 examples 2 on the 10 scale. But this 8th example is a little bit more interesting. It's a Moorish Science Temple of America, which is an American Islamic sect, which is significantly more rare than a common Christian church. So we're going to give that one a 3 on the 10 scale. Of the first 9 corner banks we cover, however, I feel this one is easily the most interesting. This is a New Life Prosthetics and Orthotics on the corner of Woodward and Milwaukee in the New Center area of town, maybe Milwaukee Junction. And it's been running as a prosthetics and orthotics operation for around 10 years now, as far as I know. And the business owners that currently inhabit it, I believe they are the ones that did the adaptive renovation. And these are a few pictures I lifted from their website to give you an example of the kind of work that goes on inside, which is significantly more unique, in my opinion, than the other locations we've covered so far. So I give this adaptive renovation a 4 on the 10 scale. I'm sorry, a 5. No, a 4. Okay, sorry about that. Now we're going to look at 5 auto industry buildings in the Detroit area that have been used in some capacity or another as a museum at some point. And we're going to start with what is most likely the most unsuccessful of this group. This is the Packard Motor Car Company plant on Grand Boulevard in Detroit. And I would guess that many people in the audience are familiar with a redevelopment plan put forth in 2016 by Peruvian Fernando Palazuela. And Palazuela's plan was very ambitious, and a lot of people had some really great positive attitudes about it. And he got far enough that in 2017, he opened the doors to tourists. And this is where it fulfills its slightly museum-esque reuse. Unfortunately, by the time the production tunnel from building 12 to building 27 collapsed in early 2019, it had become pretty apparent that Palazuela was not going to be able to bring his dream into the realm of reality. And today, the Packard plant, unfortunately, still sits mostly empty and unused. We'll move on now to the Ford Motor Company Willow Run Bomber Plant. This is hangar number 1. This is one of only 2 buildings remaining at this factory site. I visited in August 2020 to attempt to make photographs from the fence line, and I got really lucky because there was a fellow who pulled up to the fence and asked me what I was doing. I told him, and he said, well, come on in and take a look. And it was at that time I found out that this hangar currently doubles as a storage hangar for the Yankee Air Museum, located completely on the other side of Willow Run Airport, in a different county, in fact. Yankee Air Museum is a very cool place that has a large collection of historic aircraft, and they do a excellent air show once a year that you can watch from Ecorse Road. I highly recommend it. We will move on now to the Packard Proving Grounds on Van Dyke Ave, significantly north of town in Shelby Township. And there's a really nice group of Albert Kahn designed buildings here, 3 of them, as well as the gate and the entryway. And the Packard Motor Company Foundation, I believe they're called, they acquired this property in 1999 with an intent to convert it to a historic site and a cultural site. And among the top items in their mission is preserving the lovely Albert Kahn architecture. I love showing an aerial shot of this area when talking about adaptive renovations, because arguably the entire neighborhood, the entire square suburban mile that the 2.5 mile oval test track once occupied has been adaptively renovated into a neighborhood. And it's great that you can still see its outline there among all the new developments. And we have, with the blue pinpoint, the Packard Proving Grounds just to the right. And if you go searching for historical information about the site, you'll find that a few speed records were set back in its heyday. We're going to move on now to the Ford Motor Company Rouge plant in Dearborn. And I would imagine that a large percentage of my audience is aware that the Rouge has hosted factory tours for many years. You can find out about it by visiting the Henry Ford Museum's website. And if we look further into it, we find out that, wow, they actually were having public tours here as early as 1924. And this is while the plant is still basically under construction. Also, we'll see if we look more closely that visitorship peaks out around the mid 60s and late 70s with close to 250,000 people a year. And also there's a few decades in there where there are no tours run, but it's still running at this point to the best of my knowledge. And not only did the Rouge run tours, the previous plant in Highland Park that Ford moved from to the Rouge, in their last years, they were drawing over 150,000 tourists a year. So I find these usages that are slightly museum-esque, the tours that take place, they happened in Kahn's lifetime, so that's not very surprising. In fact, I've even speculated the possibility that maybe Albert Kahn Incorporated arranged some of the renovations to make tours possible at some point. So I rate this very high, very low on the list of on the unintended consequences scale, and we'll give it a 2. There is one exception to this museums as auto industry buildings as museums, however, and this is one of the most interesting cases that I studied for this lecture. It was a real joy learning about this building. Here we see the Standard Auto Company garage and showroom at 4454 Woodward in Detroit, built in 907, and it's confirmed by the Free Press clipping that Albert Kahn is the architect with Ernest Wilby as his associate. Well, the Standard Auto Company, they maintain ownership of this property until approximately 1916, at which point a Dodge car dealer by the name of Thomas Doyle takes over, and an adaptive renovation is detailed in the clipping in the center there. Well, Doyle, he's got one satellite branch on East Jefferson, but this is his main branch. So if a person who lived in the Midtown area of Detroit, say, wanted to buy a car from Doyle, well, most likely he'd come to this Woodward branch. And it's my opinion that Ty Cobb, who did buy a car from Doyle in 1916, is about 85 to 95% chance he bought it here, in my opinion. And we can see from this Polk's Detroit City Directory that Cobb was indeed a Midtown guy. He's lived at Longfellow and Atkinson over the course of his time in Detroit, and one other Midtown street that was a little bit closer to downtown. And if you look at Ty Cobb's batting averages here from 1907 to 1919, we will see that he led the American League every year except for 1916, begging the very obvious question, should he have bought a Ford? Doyle hangs on to this location until approximately 1923, at which point Aaron DeRoy opens his auto dealership. Aaron DeRoy is quite a prominent citizen in Detroit, and he operates from this location until about 1935, at which point a long list of tenants begins. And of these many tenants that occupy the building from 1937 to 1991, the Yale and Town Manufacturing Company are the most important, but not just because they have the longest tenure of 14 years, 4 of those years with Eaton, but because when they take occupancy of the building in 1955, they publish a photo of their facility, and we can see that the dimensions of the building are a very, very close match to the original Standard Auto Company garage, and this rules out any possibility that there's been a rebuild on this site. Also in 1962, we see a clipping that informs us of yet another renovation to the building for Yale in Town's purposes, and it gets a little bit bigger and it gets rearranged on the inside. It kind of leaves the public record for about a decade in the 90s, and then in the 2000s, 2006, it reemerges and is reborn as the Museum of Contemporary Art Detroit. And this is why it is different than the other examples. This is the only Kahn building being used as a museum facility that is not for its original purpose. All the others, you know, they fulfilled some task in the auto industry, and that's what the museum was about, or the tour was about. This has fine art in it, and it makes it totally different. And for that reason, I rate the unintended consequences here about a 6 on the 10 scale. The adaptive renovation is managed by a local guy who's got a Michigan connection. He got his Bachelor in Fine Arts from U of M, and his local connection is tight enough that in 1999, he is allowed editorial space in the Detroit Free Press to discuss his multi-use redevelopment proposal for Tiger Stadium that unfortunately never comes to fruition. But what is fortunate is that through three adaptive renovations over a century, that a portion of Albert Kahn's original masonry arrangement remains on the north side of the building at the Museum of Contemporary Art's front door. And for that, we thank the redesigners. We're going to move on to a portion of the lecture now that I call They Did What? And this is going to deal primarily with refacings and remodelings that, you know, are pretty much regarded as unattractive in the present day. There's one that's not as, it doesn't belong in this group as much as the others, but we'll get to it in a second. We're going to start with the United Savings Bank at 1133 Griswold Street in the Capitol Park neighborhood of Detroit. Excuse me. This is directly across the street from the Stott building. And we can see its original appearance as Albert Kahn designed it on the left here. And then in the center, we'll see what Daniels and Zermatt of Ann Arbor did to it in 1965, when apparently employees were just having too many distractions, staring out the window and daydreaming. Well, they've got a solution for it, and they also have a solution for your window washing budget. And it's interesting to me that the Detroit Free Press would describe such an adaptive renovation as a facelift, because I believe at this point in the 21st century, most people see these buildings side to side and would describe it more as a face punch. Here's another egregious example that gets me a little heartbroken every time I drive by it. This is the Lakeshore Global building at the corner of Woodward and Grand. And in the mid 60s, it was refaced with this stucco-ish horizontal bands there. We are able to determine the date by W. Hawkins Ferry's writings in the Building of Detroit, a seminal volume regarding Detroit architectural history. And I also hunted down a few pictures that show its original appearance and I think make pretty much anyone wonder why they traded in the present appearance for this. Well, Hawkins Ferry tells us the terracotta began to deteriorate and that led to the refacing. But me personally, I would have tried to replace the terracotta or have it repaired, but I really don't know much about how difficult or expensive that would have been. The last of these garish renovations that I'd like to talk about is the Security Trust Building at 735 Griswold in the financial district of Detroit. This is a building that is covered in sumptuous Corrado Parducci sculpture. And Corrado Parducci himself had an opinion about this addition. And he says so in a 1975 interview with the Smithsonian. When this two-story addition is covered in the Free Press in 1965, an architectural firm is not named. And I can't help but wonder if that's on purpose, because when you compare the original side by side with what we're seeing today, well, it's you can't really argue with Parducci's conclusion. He loses a little bit of the sculpture in the process too. So this gives us a chance to think about what Albert Kahn might have thought of the era in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where neoclassical facades were regularly getting unsympathetically altered or just straight up covered up. And I think that he wouldn't have liked it. And for that reason, I think we will rate it a pretty high degree of unintended consequences in the 5 range, although, you know, that's kind of more like a -5 than a +5. One other interesting adaptive renovation is the Security Trust that I have to tell you about. I was so surprised when I found this in a 1980 issue of the Detroit Free Press. It was home to a burger chef for a few years around 1980, and the Security Trust building right around the corner, excuse me, it got a McDonald's. This is another building that's covered in Parducci. And fast food, as we know it, it isn't really invented till 1948, approximately 6 years after Kahn passes away. And for that reason, we also give this a very high degree of unintended consequences, and we're going to rate it on our scale as a 6. Moving back to our original discussion, though, of renovations that are less than 100% aesthetically pleasing. This is our least egregious example, St. Dunstan's Playhouse in Bloomfield Hills on Lone Pine Road. And this is originally built as an open air building, but between 1930 and 1934, the arches are filled in, first with glass and then with stucco and brick. And the architect who executes these changes is a really highly respected guy, Eliel Saarinen, who has designed a large portion of the Cranbrook campus. So I think a lot of people are kind of surprised when they find out that Saarinen spearheaded this design, but I speculate, and maybe a Cranbrook archivist could tell me more, that he was probably assigned this project and it most likely wasn't his idea to fill in the arches. In my opinion, a filled in arch in general is not a great look, but this is about as graceful as it can be done. This was originally known as the Cranbrook Garden House, and it was an adjunct to the open air Greek theater that people would gather at during intermissions and such. And here's an example of its original appearance. On the left, we have a photo from the Cranbrook Archives. On the right, we have an original drawing segment from Albert Kahn Associates Incorporated, and I thank them for allowing me to use it tonight. But to get an idea of why they wanted to fill this in, well, we need only look a short ways into newspaper articles in the day, because in the first season after the alterations are completed, they host a lecture series featuring some of the very modernists that Kahn influences in their early days. Le Corbusier, probably to a greater extent than Frank Lloyd Wright. Also, I can't stand pronouncing Le Corbusier's name because I feel like I'm getting it wrong every time. We are now going to move on to the top 4 in my lecture, and these are my favorite examples and the reason I wrote this lecture. We're going to start off with the Highland Park State Bank branch at 16549 Woodward Avenue in Detroit, built around 1920. If we look closely at the main entrance, we'll see that it's the Geneva Avenue branch, and Geneva Avenue intersects Woodward and McNichols right at Woodward and McNichols. So this building is still there right on the corner, but you likely don't recognize it because it's changed so much. If we work our way around to this collage clockwise from the top left, we'll see there's a number of interesting inhabitants throughout the decades of the 20th century. We've got general contractors, some home sellers, some evidence of petty crime in 1944, some insurance companies. And then in 1972, we see that it's first evidence of use as an adult movie theater. And this continues into 1991, at which point we are very fortunate to have a traveling photographer by the name of Camilo Jose Vergara that likes to come to North American cities and document the changes on corners that he likes. And this ends up being one of them. We see here in 1993, it's still being used as an adult movie theater. In 2002, almost all of the facade decoration is scraped off. And by 2008, it is reclad in a stucco-esque pink and white that I find very aesthetically unpleasing. And it is turned into an adult entertainment facility. The use that it maintains to this day. I shot this photo just last summer. It's only changed its corporate name to Playground After Dark. And because of the slightly taboo nature of the commerce that happens inside this building, and also because it's an aspect of American culture that was far less developed in Kahn's time than it is now, we give this a very, very high rating on the scale of unintended consequences, and it gets an 8. Let's move on now to the Union Drawn Steel Company plant at 237 Josh Compound in the Rivertown section of Detroit. This is a building that is not very commonly known among local architectural historians as a Kahn design, but I was very fortunate to be able to prove that it was, and I'm pleased to present it as such tonight. I was able to prove it by examining original drawings at Albert Kahn Associates, and I thank them once again for allowing me to use their drawings tonight. But it's not just the original drawings that prove the case. There's also a blurb in the Free Press in 1916, a confirmation of the address in Polk's Detroit City Directory from 1922 to 23, and an auto industry periodical from 1920 that confirms that the Union Draw Steel Company does in fact have a branch facility in Detroit. If we take a look at some of its uses over the 20th century, we see for a while it's owned by Republic Steel. Stroh Industries is not the brewer. It's a light industrial outfit that has numerous small plants in the Rivertown area at this point. Also, a company named Warner Swasey appears to own it for a while. And then it goes up for sale in 1987. And the sales agent, Steve Campbell, would like the public to know that it is ideal for conversion to use other than industrial. And Steve Campbell knows of which he speaks, because this building has been used as Atwater Brewery since 1997, a brand many of you are likely familiar with. One of the general managers, Chris Owens, gave me free rein to make some photos around the facility a few weeks ago in preparation for this lecture, and I'd like to thank him at this point. We can see some evidence of its former heavy industrial use by the red beam in the very back of the building there. That is actually an overhead crane that ran the distance of the building, but is now immobilized. I also got a nice look at the offices section of the building, and this is most likely original from when it was built, but I can't prove it as well as the exterior because I was not able to examine interior drawings. But if we look on the right from a quote I took from the website, you'll see that the original owners' focus was bringing back the Bohemian style lager that Stroh's Brewing Company had made famous right in this area in the 1800s. Now, converting this building to a brewery by itself, it's not that crazy. It's not that exciting. It wouldn't rate that high on my scale. But what is really interesting about this building's usage is that it coincides with an explosion in the 1990s with a small batch and craft breweries. And this is a subculture that didn't exist in Kahn's lifetime. In Kahn's lifetime, the ethos of your usual brewer was to try to get bigger and try to increase your market segment at every turn. And here we have an intentional effort to stay small and to brew small batches. And not only that, We're looking at Detroit history themed brands with Detroit imagery and Michigan flavors. And I think those developments in brewery culture would be kind of a surprise to Kahn. And for that reason, I rate this adaptive renovation a 7. Now let's look at the Murray Body Corporation plant on the I-75 North Service Drive, just north of Grand Boulevard. If you drive up and down I-75 regularly, you've almost certainly noticed these buildings. A common misconception about this site is that every building on it is a Kahn design. That is not true. Only the buildings highlighted in white on the left in my aerial shot, only those are the Kahn design buildings. And on the right, we see a Sanborn Insurance Map. Sanborn Insurance Maps are a tool that architectural historians use all over the United States to determine the building dates of when they're trying to differentiate building from building at a site like this, where they've been built on top of each other. Well, Murray Body's run at this site ends in the mid-50s. They shortly after have a public auction that clears out most of what's in the interior, and it sits vacant for about 5 years until it's reborn in 1960 as the Russell Industrial Center. And the new owners, they want to make it into a mixed-use development, and they are successful in that effort to a certain extent. And in the 60s, they frequently get in the paper and are able to boast of the number of companies they have running concurrently at their facility. But as we move into the 70s, 80s, and 90s, in the early years, we're looking at paper producers, binderies, publishers, things that are kind of in that area industry, but it kind of transits to being more small space for local artists, artisans, studio space. And one really awesome example I found of adaptive reuse over the years, and I have to say that there's no guarantee it happened inside one of the Kahn buildings, but there's a high likelihood. This is a clothing company that was kind of popular in Detroit in the late 90s called Ghetto Rags, and they were trying to cash in on Detroit's rough image. And they had a certain degree of success. Some of you might recognize their logo and the brand name. But what was really super interesting about this reuse for me is if you look at the caption on the left side clipping, you'll see that one of the guys in this group is a fella named Mark Arminsky. Who is Mark Arminsky, you may ask? Well, he's one of the greatest concert poster designers to ever come out of Detroit. And the best years of his career are the 1990s. In fact, right around the time that we see him here inside the Russell Industrial Center, meaning that there's probably a decent chance that he may have designed a few of his posters here. And I was just really pleased to find him engaged in adaptive reuse of the site that's dominated by Kahn buildings. I was able to tour the facility recently. Thank you to leasing agent Nathan Sellers, who was so kind to show me around and let me get photographs of the very unique interior spaces we find here. He tells me that it's owned by Dennis Kefalinos. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And that's a pretty prominent property owner in Detroit. And that currently they have 172 tenants. Excuse me. But Sellers tells me most of those 172 tenants occupy smaller spaces within the facility, and that renting out the larger space is a little bit tougher. So he was able to show me a couple of the larger interior spaces. And the dead giveaway for the Kahn designs in this facility are the support columns that widen at the top. You don't really see that in the non-Kahn buildings at this site. And I really enjoyed getting these interior pictures because I feel like the steel sash curtain walls that are so common to Kahn designs, they're just as dramatic from the interior as they are from the exterior. This is a room that some local spray painter graffiti artists were given free rein with a few years back. And here's a look at the interior space in the southernmost building that was once used as the Russell Bazaar, but at this point, the larger building is completely vacant. Once again, we see the dead giveaway for Kahn design at this site being the very unique shape of the support columns. So none of the uses I've showed you thus far have been that revolutionary or crazy. What reuse of this facility might fulfill that description? Well, to answer that question, we're going to look at something that was happening around Detroit in the 2010s, and not just Detroit, but nationwide and worldwide. Spray painting, muralism, outdoor art that was influenced by the graffiti scenes of New York City in the 1970s Well, it really experiences a huge burst in popularity, and not only popularity, but also legitimacy in the general public. And Detroit is a place that ends up being one of the national centers for this explosion because we've got a lot of empty vacant real estate and there's not a ton of oversight. So legal and illegal walls proliferated in Detroit in this time, and getting a wall to paint on around 2012 to 2018, it was one of the easiest things in the world. But a graffiti style art alone painted on an Albert Kahn building is not enough to rate number 2 on our list. What might be? Well, when the subject matter is our subject, Albert Kahn, that makes a huge, huge difference in my opinion. And this is just an amazing case of Albert Kahn's influence reaching into multiple generations after his life and bearing influence on an art scene that isn't developed until 30 years after he dies and doesn't really achieve its maturity until about 70 years after he dies. And this, to me, imparts a great degree of unintended consequences. This mural is painted by a local by the name of Kyle Danley in 2014. And Kyle tells me this is the first mural he ever painted, and that he is now a full-time mural painter, which I think is a pretty impressive wrinkle in the story. There is one caveat, however. This artwork actually got painted on one of the buildings within the facility that is not a Kahn design. And for that reason, we cannot give it a 10 on our scale of rating unintended consequences. This is not an adaptive reuse of a Kahn building. It's adaptive reuse of a building at a site dominated by Kahn buildings. And for that reason, we can only give it an 8 on our 10 scale. We're going to move on to our number 1 entry now, folks. And we are again going to look at the Packard plant on Grand Boulevard in Detroit. This is building number 27, built from 1909 to 1910. I believe the first 2 floors and the second 2 floors were added about a half decade later. We learn about the dates of construction and the building numbers by looking closely at Sanborn Insurance Maps again. And let's look at a little of the history before we make the big reveal. In the mid-50s, just like the Russell Industrial Center, Packard's run in Detroit, you know, it comes to an end and it lies vacant for a little while after a public auction. And it is reborn as Packard Properties 2 years later in 1958. And over the next 3 decades, there is a variety of interesting inhabitants. I've collected just a few here. We'll see in the 60s that the Defense Contract Administration Services Regional Office is located here. And that's a government agency that organizes between military contractors and the military. So that's a pretty interesting use. On the far right, we'll see that General Motors appears to be running repossession auctions out of this location. And on the bottom right, we'll see that the city of Detroit is using at least one of the buildings for an employment and a training department. Well, none of those uses are really interesting enough that we would rate it number 1 on our list. So what would be? Well, would you believe, friends, that this story comes back to my original time in Detroit in the early 90s and my interest in Detroit techno? In the bitter cold of February 1993, a good friend of mine dragged me to Detroit to attend a party at a location called the Packard plant that I've never heard of. I had no idea of its historical significance, and I had no idea of the architect. But when I did get there, I had an experience that was nothing short of religious, watching an artist by the name of Richie Houghton perform for about 4 to 6 hours. And I was there for the whole thing. And you'll see on the flyer on the lower right, which is actually from a party in 1994, a year later, that the address of the Packard plant is indeed listed. Richie Houghton, he becomes one of the biggest international techno stars, as he is to this day, but he's not the only one over the years that makes music in this place. If we look closely at the flyer on the far left, on the bottom, we'll see that our artists performing this evening are Juan Atkins, Kevin Saunderson, Eddie Folks, and Derek May. And these 4 guys make up the absolute core of early techno producers in Detroit that essentially invented this style of music that was exported all over the world, and whose influence at this point is so pervasive that it rivals even Motown in terms of its influence. We're very fortunate to have this collection of flyers before you because back in the day when raves were regularly held here, there was an air of secrecy, and it wasn't often that the address got printed right on the flyer. We'd like to thank Mark Moss, a person who partook in this scene in the mid-90s, who donated quite a few flyers to our cause here. This one on the right commemorates Po' Boy's last event held at Packard in 1998. And this is one of the companies that's most commonly holds events here at the Packard. So a lot of times I get to this point in my spiel and I can hear in my head people asking, well, that's great, Dale. Well, but where's the actual photographic evidence that this happened? Well, I'll tell you what, folks, it's really, really rare because back in the day when somebody brought a camera to an event like this, it was not to capture architectural features. It was to capture themselves and their friends having a good time. So finding photos of the interior of the Packard plant in a party state, it's really, really tough. I'd like to thank Dat Duong of Grand Rapids, Michigan, who donated this photo to my cause. And usually when I get to this picture, I can hear people in my head asking, that's great, Dale, but that could be any industrial space. But it's not. It's definitely the Packard plant. And we see that by examining the octagonal support piers, which are very unique. But more important than that, if we examine the stains left on the ceiling by the fire extinguishing equipment, we'll find that they are an exact match. And this is most definitely the space that was used most frequently by people that threw events in this day. It's not just that a music that got exported to the rest of the world happened here. What's even more important is that techno's best way of being presented to the public is in a live environment. And to a lot of people who are deeply ensconced in this scene for many years, the Packard plant's events represent pretty much the absolute apotheosis of how techno music is presented in the live environment. Using an old blown out industrial building for a rave party was not pioneered in Detroit. It was pioneered in London and Manchester, England, just a few years earlier, but it was perfected here. And it was perfected so well that to this day, many microscenes in many cities throughout North America and the rest of the world attempt to capture the vibe that was captured at the Packard plant in the mid-90s. And that concludes my presentation to unique and unexpected renovations of Albert Kahn design spaces. If you folks enjoyed what you saw tonight, I encourage you to purchase my book. It's available at 2 locations in Detroit, Detroit Artist Market on Woodward and Pier Detroit's location inside the Fisher Building. And you can also get it in the suburbs at Bookbeat in Oak Park. But if you're out of town, feel free to put in the title and my name, and my book is probably the first thing that's going to pop up. I thank you all for your attention tonight.
All right, Dale. Hey, thanks very much. Really fascinating look at some of these things. Couple of questions from folks. Frank Martin says, a relative of mine is a muralist, Desiree Kelly, working on a portrait of Albert Kahn wearing his glasses. Is that the one that you showed us?
No, that one's by Kyle Danley is the fella's name. He lives in the Points. And that artwork is not without precedent, actually. There was another earlier example of Albert Kahn with glasses on the American Heaters building on Woodward that got torn down in the middle 2010s. And that may be the example he's speaking of. I considered loosely throwing that one into the lecture, but I had limited time and space, so I chose against it. And there's another great mural of that says "We Can Do It" on Grand Boulevard that I'd guess you've probably driven by a few times, John. It doesn't have a visual of Kahn's face, but it is a reference to Kahn, and it has an outline of the Fisher Building. And that's a pretty prominent Kahn-related mural around too. It's not painted on a Kahn building or a facility that's dominated by Kahn designs, though.
All right, and Roger Lusick from the Packard Motor Car Foundation, owner of the Packard Proving Grounds, was wondering, and you might have done this already, but how do you score their attempts to preserve the campus of Kahn buildings?
Well, I score them a 10 because those buildings, first of all, they appear to be spectacularly maintained. From my understanding, we were in danger of losing those buildings in the late 1990s. And if you read my book carefully, the foreword, you'll see that one of my #1 goals is to get people more interested in Kahn preservation when there's a danger of demolition, and it looks like those properties were in danger to some extent. So anybody who's that heavily engaged in preservation of the Kahn legacy, well, I don't know you personally, but I love you.
Okay, very good. Just a couple more. Jim Lewiston suggests, how about a techno museum and live venue at the Packard? Do you think that could ever happen, or is it too far gone?
Well, that actually was part of Palazuela's plan, was a techno hostel, a techno venue. And, well, I mean, to be completely honest, I feel that techno has kind of passed its era of being groundbreaking. And although it might be successful to the current generation of fans to some extent, I feel like a lot of techno culture these days revolves around trying to be like we were in Detroit in 94, or even more to the point, like Manchester and London in 89. So, a lot of these artists in Detroit that got famous here, they were famous in Europe first. They had hits while they were still playing in a scene that was in its adolescence in Detroit. It was in its maturity in Europe. But the Packard plant buildings, there's so much to talk about there. A lot of people in the local architectural community believe that no building is ever beyond being restored. And there's some great examples locally that I think drive home that point. So I think it does have potential. And I also think one of the main reasons that those buildings still stand is they're so solid that they're hard to knock down, and nobody wants to take the contract for demolitions because they're afraid they're going to lose a ton of money on it. So any redevelopment is going to be better than what is currently happening there. So I would support it, even though I'm not that heavy into techno anymore.
Okay. We have several people who just want to say great lecture and happy to hear the news about your book, and they're going to go out and get it.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And let's see. Carol Rose Kahn asks, how would you rate the repurposing of the U of M Natural History Museum into the current U of M administration building? Are you familiar with that one?
Are we talking about the Alexander G. Ruthven building?
Well, Carol, maybe you can add more to your question.
Well, while she's adding more to the question, I would just, I hope Carol doesn't mind me noting that she is a granddaughter of Albert Kahn, and somebody that has been very helpful over the course of my research. And she's just been an extremely encouraging voice as far as the current book goes. And I, in the future, will be working on a book that focuses strictly on Kahn's drawings that he made, freehand drawings that he made over the course of his life. And
Right.
Carol's been super helpful with that also.
Right. Let's see. You spoke about the old Temple Bethel, aka Bonstel, but not about the later one at Woodward and Gladstone. Any thoughts on that later Temple Bethel?
I haven't examined it nearly as closely. It's
still a religious use, I believe.
Yeah, I believe it went by Lighthouse Cathedral for many years, and it had a Protestant congregation in there. And I'm in favor of any reuse of a Kahn building that, keeps it in our presence.
Right.
But I'm not sure it's occupied right now. And a lot of those church buildings along Piety Hill in Detroit are underutilized for many decades now. And, I yearn for our culture to come up with alternative uses for these buildings to make them viable again, because when a church is torn down in Detroit, regardless if there's a congregation that has recently inhabited, it's a huge, huge loss for architectural history. We're one of the most significant cities in the United States for church construction, by my estimation. So any adaptive reuse that's happened in there, I'm for it. Sometimes there's not enough money around to keep buildings in as good a shape as they should be, though, and that is unfortunate.
Yeah. And I think we have one quick one. How much is the book?
The book is $35. It's all full color photography inside, so it's a little bit pricey for a paperback. But as an independent self-publisher that is trying to appeal to a regional interest, I think most people are, they're going to be fine with the cover price.
Okay. And finally, any more lectures coming up? People are asking. Ed wants to know, any more chances to see you lecture?
Yeah, hi, thanks for asking, Ed. I'm actually going to do a Corrado Parducci lecture in Grosse Pointe in February. I believe that's on February 10th. For the Royal Oak Public Library, I have I believe a Parducci lecture scheduled in April and a Kahn scheduled for June. Also, I have lectured on Parducci on quite a few occasions, and I'm extremely proud of those lectures. And one of the best ones, I think, is posted by the East Baton Rouge Public Library. That's down in Louisiana. And the reason they asked me to present is that Parducci has quite a bit of, and his brother have quite a bit of work on Louisiana State Capitol, which is a super, super important building in American architectural history. So I got to talk a lot about the other sculpture on the building in that lecture. So I touch on things other than Parducci, and I really think it's my most interesting presentation that you can find online. But also I did a great one for the Grand Rapids Historical Society that you can also find online.
Okay. Just by searching for your name, I guess, right?
Put Dale Carlson and Parducci in. Do it in YouTube. You're more likely to get the result immediately, but it'll come up within the first couple pages if you do it in Google.
Okay. And do you sell your photographs? Barbara wants to know.
I do. In fact, I love selling my photographs, but I tell you, as an artist, I am way more into the creating process than I am into the promotional process. And I suffer because of it, because I really feel that my photography is excellent and there's a market for it, but I am not as enthused about seeking out that market and making sales as I am about writing new books and making new photographs. So if anybody has any ideas in that vein or wants to be my agent, Barbara, well, I'd probably let them.
And so just final question, what's your contact? Where can people reach you? Do you have a website you want to cite again, or?
I don't use the website much, but yeah, and it's not that functional either because I haven't maintained it in so long. I believe there's some articles that, the pictures won't come up. But like I said, it's going to come down soon. That website is called ilovedetroitmichigan.com. But if you'd like to contact me personally, I will talk about architectural history until you tell me to stop. And my email address is 1971dac@gmail.com. Shall I repeat it?
Repeat that, please. Yeah.
1971dac@gmail.com.
So I think you've told us what your birth year is.
I have, yes. I turned 50 this year. I don't feel it though.
Okay, very good. Well, Dale Carlson, delightful lecture. I'm sure we all want to thank you very much. And we look forward to following your work in the future. And on that, folks, as I said at the beginning, albertkahnlegacy.org is our website. If you want to follow what future events we have and how to become a member and so on, check out the website and we'll see you next time. So Dale Carlson, thanks again.
My pleasure, John. Thank you so much for inviting me tonight. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Good night, everybody.